Hello everyone, welcome back to my latest history video. Today I would like to speak on a topic about which knowledge is spreading more and more, but which until recently was comparatively less well known. Now coming to the story of our Indian freedom struggle, it has been popularly assumed until now that the power of non-violence and love was what enticed the British to withdraw from India. The true story of the freedom struggle is somewhat a little less glamorous and less fairy tale like. I mean, non-violence did help, but there was another side to the freedom struggle, namely the violent revolutionary side also, which immensely helped, but whose importance was diminished by the independent government of India post-independence for political reasons. So in this video, I would like to speak about how the revolutionary part of the Indian freedom struggle helped uh, India to become independent. And not only that, but revolutionaries were not merely isolated thugs operating within India, occasionally striking against the British, that they were an extremely well organized global network which fought against the British Empire at several places. I will speak more on this detail further on, but before this, moving ahead, there is a book which is the source of this video, a very popular book. It is called Revolutionaries, the Other Side of How India Won Its Freedom. This book is written by a fellow called Sanjeev Sanyal. A very well-known author. Has written a lot of books relating to contemporary history of India, and this is a very particularly attractive, easy to read book where Sanjeev Sanyal has exposed in detail that along with the non-violence aspect of Indian freedom struggle, how the revolutionary part of it also immensely helped uh, in attaining our freedom, and how the diminished role that our official history textbooks have assigned the revolutionary struggle is not truly so. That how the revolutionary aspect of our struggle greatly influenced the fight for freedom, and how it was so immense, so vast, and so full of conspiracies and plots, and overall it was a pretty exciting thing, the revolutionary part, and very dangerous as well. So those of you want to explore more about this part, uh, please feel free to refer this book. This book is available online. You can buy it from Amazon at a very low price, and it gives very interesting details, and this book forms the source of all the material content in this video. Now I would like to speak more about, now let's move ahead on the topic that I'm going to talk about today, the revolutionary part. So as I said earlier, it has been assumed commonly that the revolutionary struggle was just a struggle by isolated armed people who occasionally struck against the British. But that's not really the case. Especially in this book of revolutionaries, Sanjeev Sanyal has talked about how the revolutionary movement was really a very sophisticated movement. So, uh, as said, the revolutionaries struggle, you could say it started with the 1857 revolt, but and it carried on for the better part of the remaining 90 years of British rule. It was happening on that before that as well, with the British East India Company encountering armed resistance every time they conquered bit by bit of India. But what I mean to say is that it's essentially from 1857 onwards, which was the first mass armed struggle against British colonial rule, which unfortunately failed. For the remaining 90 years, revolutionary movements sprung up throughout British ruled India. Generations of revolutionaries rose up, and not only did they fight against British rulers, they even trained other people to for armed resistance against colonial rule. Essentially, when it was time for them to pass the torch to the younger fighters. That's what they did. So essentially it was a so it essentially it was not as a struggle by isolated people. It was a movement, a sort of an intergenerational movement, which uh, as that's what I said, intergenerational link. Essentially, this is not the case where one armed person just shot a British officer and all, and then thought, okay, that's it. I'm calling it a day. I've done my work. Now India will be free. It wasn't like that. The revolutionaries knew that the struggle against oppression would be a long one, hard one, and that they would need to train future generations who are inspired by the struggle of the old revolutionaries to carry on. So the revolutionaries also were in charge of organized networks where they would train young people who are inspired by the work of the other revolutionaries to carry on their work. So essentially it was not limited to just one generation. This carried on for multiple generations until the end of colonial rule in 47. And this was not a simple case of gun shooting or bomb exploding by armed thugs or anything. This movement also had strategic objectives. Many of these armed movements, they were essential. They composed of vast networks of people who all operated in different cells. They would be in charge of gathering information, selecting targets to strike, and how to hit hard and all. And it wasn't just a case of inciting violence for no good reason. These revolutionary movements operated with one clear goal in mind: to to make India free from oppression, and also to turn India into a independent republican state which would be free to govern itself by its own laws without dependence on an outside power. And these revolutionary movements didn't just do gun shooting for no reason. Like I said, they selected specific targets to attack, which would have a clear political impact on the landscape. And they also had vast intelligence networks right on line with the intelligence networks of sovereign states, where they would gather information on targets operating outside India, and how striking them would benefit the Indian movement for independence and so on. And like I said earlier, they also operated with a long-term vision to turn India into an independent Indian state, free from oppression by the British. Now, there was this revolutionary movement was not just limited to India. See, the British Empire, the heart of it was both Britain, and the crown jewel was considered India. But they knew that the revolutionaries knew that the India that even if they rose up against the British in India, the British could call on reinforcements from various outposts throughout the empire, all over the world, and help suppress whatever rebellion was occurring in India. This actually had happened in 1857, where the Britishers, with the help of advanced communications, their communication network was pretty advanced compared to the rebelling Indians. So, using those communication networks, and they were able to garner reinforcements from other places of the empire around the world, and they were able to bring in sufficient troops to suppress the 1857 rebellion. So they knew that, so the revolutionaries who subsequently, who rose after the 1857 rebellion, knew that they also had to create similar intelligence networks, global level intelligence networks. So that's what they did. Now there were several places where where revolutionaries were situated, where they operated to provide aid to the revolutionaries located in India. One was London and Paris. So during the British era, India didn't have many universities uh, good and many universities. So if you wanted to like pursue higher education at a very good university, you mostly had to go to either London or the nearest European capital being Paris. So Indian students went there, and many of the students who had a patriotic feeling of wanting to liberate their motherland from the oppression of British rule, they formed revolutionary networks there. Not just Indian students, mind you, even the revolutionaries in India also often emigrated to these places where they could inspire Indian students to revolt against British rule by recruiting them and training them in armed rebellion. The London and Paris was where most Indian students went for studies, which revolutionaries identified as a prime recruitment ground for the revolutionary movements. Then another place of support was Berlin and Tokyo. Now, during both world wars, specifically World War II, they Nazi Germany and Japan, they fought against the Allied powers, which was comprised of Britain and its empire. So Indian revolutionaries found these two capitals to be particularly suitable for conducting revolutionary activity, and they would also collaborate with the governments of both these countries, which would in turn provide them aid in the form of hardware and intelligence on important British officials and so on. So, and of course, both of these countries also would officially sign declarations of Indian independence and provide all sorts of aid to the revolutionaries to help in Indian independence for their own gain, of course, since an independent India would be grateful to these two countries for their assistance, and they could hope to build beneficial political relations with an independent India, and also as a way of striking against the British during wartime. Then another place was in America itself, which happened to be an ally of Britain, but America history was such that it had also gained independence from the British Empire in somewhere around 1789 with the American Revolution, and also they were pretty much sympathetic to the Indian independence cause. So uh, Indian revolutionists chose to establish bases in America as well, particularly in these two places of San Francisco and Vancouver. So particularly during the First World War, this served as a base for the Ghadar Party. I will speak further on this, but during World War I, there had been an attempt at inciting armed rebellion by the Indian soldiers fighting for the British at that time in the First World War. So some Indian students and revolutionaries, they had this amazing idea of trying to incite Indian soldiers to rebel against their British masters. Unfortunately, the attempt had failed, but it was a good try nonetheless. Then another was Singapore, Southeast Asia. During World War II, when the Japanese conquered the British ruled Singapore, Malaysia, and other Southeast Asian colonies, they took prisoner many Indian soldiers serving for the British. And these Indian soldiers are heavily dissatisfied by the behavior of their British masters, particularly their racism and so on. And so the Japanese had, with the help of Subhash Chandra Bose, had constituted an Indian National Army to fight against the British, and many of these Indian POWs ended up joining the said Indian National Army. And of course, there was some local Southeast Asian resistance as well, which fought against their European masters in Southeast Asia. Then one of the most important supporters of our Indian independence movement, and almost like we were partners, our Indian revolutionaries and this particular country were literal partners in the independence movement, was Ireland. Ireland had also been heavily oppressed by the British in the past, I mean, it's funny that despite being fellow white people, the British chose to apply their racism against the Irish as well. It had culminated in a very severe famine called the potato famine in the mid 19th century, where millions of Irishmen had starved to death. Just like how it had happened during the Indian famines engineered by the British. So the Irish were also severely anti-British, and many of them were only too happy to aid the Indian revolutionaries in the independence movement. Many of our Indian revolutionaries actually took inspiration from the Irish when it came to waging their war for independence. In fact, the HS, there was an revolutionary outfit in India at the time called the HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, which took its inspiration from the Irish Republican Army. So you can see how much the Irish had an influence on our independence movement. The Irish literally partnered with Indian revolutionaries in our struggle for freedom. And if you look at our Indian flag and the Irish flag, the colors of the Indian flag greatly resemble that of the Irish flag. So again, uh, we took a lot of inspiration from the Irish struggle for freedom against the British in our own revolutionary struggle. So ahead, now, as I said earlier, the revolutionary movement was not a simple case of people taking up guns and occasionally striking at British officials in discontent. No, not really. Sanjeev Sanyal in his book and other research conducted by other historians has revealed that there were literal secret societies and networks of revolutionaries built up throughout the country and all over the world to fight against the British Raj. Since the revolutionaries knew that on their own as individuals, they could not really stand against the might of the British Empire, so they had to collaborate and work with other people. So several networks were formed. One of the earliest revolutionary networks formed was something called Anushilan Samiti. Now, this was formed in what was then United Bengal. Bengal back then comprised both West Bengal and what is today Bangladesh. So this was formed by a fellow called Sri Aurobindo Ghosh. Those of us who are Hindus would know Sri Aurobindo as a Hindu guru, but he was actually one of the founding fathers of the Indian revolutionary movement after the 1857 rebellion, that is. So now this Anushilan Samiti, the background is that uh, before the British came to India, there used to be places called akhadas throughout India. These were essentially this were essentially ashrams of a sort where especially Hindus they would send people there for military training and all. So I mean it was considered important to train in the art of the sword and stuff. So these akhadas were formed primarily for the purpose of militarizing Hindus and other affiliated religions, in particularly against against Islamic invasions. And during the British conquest of India, these akhadas attempted to fight back, but they were defeated, and the British sort of demilitarized these akhadas. You could say they defanged these akhadas, turning them into simple sports clubs. So Sri Aurobindo was fully aware of the tradition of the Akhada tradition, and he sought to revive said tradition in his fight against the British Raj. So he constituted what was called the Anushilan Samiti, which sort of operated like the Akhadas of the past, and their primary purpose was they functioned as an underground resistance, and their focus was on training young people as soldiers in the struggle for freedom. They would gather intelligence on British targets throughout India, and they were also uh, They also conducted bomb making and throwing operations. In fact, Sri Aurobindo Ghosh himself was implicated in a bomb conspiracy which had happened around the early 20th century, and he had been put on trial by the British. Of course, he had been acquitted, but unfortunately several of his comrades either ended up in jail or went to the gallows. Sri Aurobindo, his case is somewhat strange because he was a fully British educated Indian. Even his parents, his father to be more precise, was a supporter of the British. The son had been heavily indoctrinated in British supremacy. In fact, it was so extreme that his father didn't even allow Indian languages to be spoken at home. It was only strictly English was to be spoken at the Ghosh home. But Aurobindo somehow rebelled against his father's authority, against his father's pro-British stance, and he would become one of the most important revolutionary leaders in the Indian freedom struggle, literally one of the founding fathers. Then the next is the Gadar organization. This happened during the First World War. Now there were several armed struggles which happened after 1857 right until the independence of India from British rule. So during the First World War in 1915, a group of Indian students and experienced revolutionary leaders, they had organized a conspiracy to incite Indian soldiers fighting for the empire at that time against the British masters. Essentially, they wanted to replicate 1857 of sorts. Now, essentially, their belief was that since the British Empire rested on the loyalty of the Indian soldier, if the Indian soldier's loyalty was broken, the then India would become free. So this Gadar, there was no particular base for this. This was international. Considering the World War happening at the time and the vastness of the British Empire, so it made sense that this one was international. And not to mention the fact that Indian soldiers were literally fighting throughout the world, particularly in Europe, which was literally at the heart of the World War. So the focus was, as I said earlier, on inciting and mobilizing the Indian soldiers all around the world to rise up against the British, essentially a mutiny of sorts on the scale of 1857, since that's what the British were most afraid of. And the Gadar rebellion almost succeeded, but for the resourcefulness of the British. The British had their own extremely efficient intelligence network. The British intelligence network has been pretty infamous for its success even at that time in stamping out potential threats. So on the day the soldiers were to rise in rebellion, the British were successfully able to unfortunately neutralize said rebellion. Many of the potential rebels were court-martialed and sentenced to death or dismissed from their posts and so on. So sadly the Gadar rebellion failed, but it serves as an important inspiration of how nerve and daring could achieve success or could almost achieve success, but for bad luck. Then the other was Abhinav Bharat. This was centered around in India. This was founded by the famous revolutionary leader Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Anybody who's read about the Indian revolutionary struggle or even about the Indian freedom struggle itself, they would regard Vinayak Savarkar as literally a god, as literally a leader, the leader of the Indian freedom struggle, a revolutionary struggle, that is. So about Vinayak Savarkar, he had always been a fighter at heart. It is said that when he was young, he had heard about a pair of brothers called the Chafekar brothers, who had successfully killed a tyrannical British officer called Grant Ward. I don't remember the British officer's name, but he had been a very oppressive British official At the time in Pune there had been a plague going on, and his job was to uh, cure the residents of the plague, but he had not done his job properly. In fact, he had wanted the Indian residents of Pune to die as much as possible. So for his sins, the Chapekar brothers had killed him and they were hanged. When Vinayak Savarkar heard about the hanging, he had gone to the family temple in front of his home and had prayed there. He wanted to be given the strength to fight the enemy for the rest of his life. And he subsequently went on to go to London as a student and to secure, and he always had a drive to free India from the oppressive control of the British, and he was one of the biggest proponents of armed struggle. So he founded the organization Abhinav Bharat in Britain, along with some other fellow Indian students studying there. And one of the primary focus of Abhinav Bharat here was ideological training of the recruits, essentially, and ideological training as in educating the Indian students and other new recruits on the history of India prior to the British, the history which had been suppressed, and providing them armed training. Since Vinayak Savarkar was all about armed struggle, he believed that armed struggle alone could liberate India. So, which is why his organization also focused on training in arms and ammunition, arms, I would say. In fact, there is a book that Savarkar wrote which is very well known. See, it is about 1857. See, before Savarkar wrote his book, the British had won the 1857 war, so they presented their version to the public throughout the world and even in India. They presented the 1857 rebellion as the glorious suppression of mutiny by brigands and thugs and so on against the benevolent British. Now, obviously, this was false, but nobody had the courage to go against it. So, Savarkar uh, decided to write his own version, the true version of the 1857 rebellion. The book was originally written in Marathi, and the story behind how this book was written itself is a very fascinating one. After Savarkar wrote the first few chapters of the book, he had them smuggled into India disguised as harmless British texts like Don Quixote covers and so on to throw the British off their scent. Since the British were definitely censored quite ruthlessly all of these texts which went against their narrative. That said, the British did catch on to Savarkar's attempts at writing the book, so they did their best to suppress the book's publication, but they thankfully failed, and Savarkar was able to publish said book, which was circulated among Indian students and especially among revolutionary groups, and it became very popular. Of course, the British banned the book the moment it was released, so this book was not freely available at the time. This book could be obtained as contraband by paying huge sums of money. So essentially, this 1857 book almost served as a guidebook for joining the revolutionary struggle against the British oppression. And of course, after independence, the book became freely available. That's one thing. That's another thing. But Vinayak Savarkar's 1857 book was a very important foundational stone for the Indian revolutionary movement. This book is also available freely on the internet. One could go on the website and buy it at low prices. Then another very important revolutionary group was the HSRA, Hindustan Socialist Republican Army. Now, as I have said earlier, this was directly inspired from the Irish Republican Army, which had also fought for its own for Ireland's independence from British colonial rule and which had successfully done so, except for the northern part of Ireland, which still officially remains under British control, sadly. But the HSRA was inspired from the IRA, and they also conducted armed rebellion against the British. But this was mostly inspired by socialism. As the name suggested, many of the members of the HSRA were were communists and so on. Their goal was to turn India into a socialist state. See, the thing about British colonial rule was it was unbridled capitalist exploitation on a scandalous scale. The British took the resources from India at low prices and gave India back manufactured products at high prices, essentially extorting India's resources for its own gain, all the while impoverishing India. The HSRA sought to uh, rise against this and to turn India into a socialist state where people essentially into a sort of socialist welfare state where people would receive equal benefits from the state. The HSRA ran its operations again for a very long time. One of its most famous operatives was a man called Sardar Udham Singh. He had witnessed the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar in 1919, and he had vowed revenge against the British for this. He would go on. He would later on join the HSRA and become an operative. And while working for the HSRA, he traveled to London and successfully assassinated the former governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, in 1940 as revenge for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. The massacre had apparently been ordered by said governor, and he had also indulged in countless atrocities in India, in the Punjab, especially extorting money from the Indian public staying there in order to fund the Indians, in order to essentially in order to provide funds to the agents who were recruiting Indian soldiers to fight in the First World War, sort of. Essentially, in order to fund the recruitment of Indian soldiers in the First World War. That's what he had extorted the Indian public in Punjab for, and for all that, plus for orchestrating the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh, Sardar Udham Singh killed him in London in 1940 while he was giving a speech. So that is one prominent example of HSRA action. And there is even a movie called Sardar Udham which talks about it. It's a very good movie available on Amazon Prime. Those of you who are interested can watch that movie. Then the latest secret resistance society that was built was the Indian National Army. As I've explained earlier, this army was formed in Southeast Asia, comprised of Indian POWs under Japanese captivity. After the Japanese conquered the British colonies in Southeast Asia, under Subhash Chandra Bose's guidance, they went on to recruit these Indian POWs into the Indian National Army. Now, their primary aim was to militarily invade British controlled India and rule and liberate India from the British by means of force, military force. And once that happened, and Subhash Chandra Bose's plan was, once the INA liberated India, it would establish diplomatic ties with the Japanese, where essentially Japan had planned for India to be at the border of its own empire, where they would establish diplomatic ties, like obtaining necessary resources for its empire from India and all. Essentially, the usual diplomatic relationship that's prevalent between nations, something like that. Unfortunately, even the INA also failed sadly, but the legacy of the Indian National Army would later on culminate in the 1946 Royal Indian Navy Mutiny, which I talked about in an earlier video. So moving on ahead. So that said, how did our revolutionaries gain the inspiration and gain the nor to fight back against European rule. At this point in time, European rule was entrenched literally all over the world, with the British Empire, of course, being the largest. Part of the reason why English is so widespread all over the world, why English is the global language. There were several events that happened throughout the world though, where non-European powers fought back against European powers and won, successfully shattering the myth of the invincible white man, proving that the white man was more or less equal to the non-white people when it came to waging wars. Number one was the 1896 Adwa battle. In this battle, Italy had attempted to conquer Ethiopia, which it would during the 1930s under Mussolini. During 1896, when Italy had first fought Ethiopia, Ethiopia had successfully defeated Italy. This proved that a nation, an African nation, a nation of black people were deemed inferior by the white peoples. The white peoples believed that the black peoples of Africa needed the guiding hand of the white folks of Europe in order to advance further in civilization. Essentially, part of the white man's burden myth that Europeans propagated throughout the world at the time. So, Ethiopia's defeat of Italy proved that a black African nation or any non-white power could defeat a white power. That way, anti-colonial movements all over the world were inspired to rise up against their oppressing white masters. Then a very particularly well-known event which happened in 1905 was the war between Russia and Japan. This would go on even during the Second World War again between Soviet Union and Japan as well. But in this war, the Japanese successfully won against the Russian Tsarist Empire, and this war, more than any other event, literally shattered the myth that the white man would always be victorious over the blacks and brown people and so on. That this war proved that a non-Western power suitably armed and with sufficient force backing it could successfully defeat and conquer a white power. This 1905 Russo-Japanese war was literally the pivotal event that again inspired anti-colonial movements throughout the world. Um, and then the other was the 1916 Easter Rise. As I talked earlier, the Irish, despite being white, were not spared British oppression and racism. So the Irish also, and not to mention the famine that the British caused in Ireland in the mid 19th century with their own policies, just as they did in India countless times. So the Irish continuously rebelled against the British, culminating in the 1916 Easter Rise. And apparently this was an urban insurgency. The fighting apparently happened mostly in urban areas. So again, the Irish struggle provided a sort of blueprint, a sort of a guidebook really for revolutionaries all over the world on how to conduct insurgencies against colonial rule in urban areas. Then many Irish people were martyred in the Irish struggle for freedom, and and given how the Irish honored their freedom fighters, it essentially highlighted that how people who sacrificed themselves, who gave their lives for the sake of their country, how their martyrdom could inspire other people to rise up against oppression. So the 1916 Easter Rise in Ireland was also important in that aspect. Then the other more important event was the revolutions that happened in 1917. As World War One neared its conclusion, rebellions against monarchies happened in Europe and elsewhere in the world, particularly in Germany and Russia. In Russia, the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks working together overthrew the Russian Tsarist Empire and successfully established the Soviet Republic, the USSR as we all know it. Of course, the Mensheviks were sidelined by the Bolsheviks who went on to assume power for themselves. That's a different story. Then revolutions happened in Germany as well, where because of the Germany being on the losing side, the German army was heavily dissatisfied and they forced the Kaiser to abdicate and successfully established the German Republic, the Weimar Republic. Of course, the Weimar Republic failed and it gave rise to Nazi Germany and World War II. Again, a story for another time. But needless to say, these two revolutions and other revolutions that broke out in other European countries as well, Greece and elsewhere in the world, these revolutions primarily aimed to overthrow the monarchies which had proven burdensome and inefficient and establish republics in their place. But revolutionaries took a lot of inspiration from these movements. Particularly the Russian Revolution of 1917 provided an inspiration for the Indian freedom fighters, the revolutionary freedom fighters, many of whom would go on to become communists and socialists, and their aim being to turn India into a socialist or communist republic on the lines of the USSR. Since considering the ruthless capitalist exploitation of India under the British Raj, it is no surprise that they sought to turn India into a socialist state. Which is why after independence, the founding fathers of independent India actively rejected the capitalism of the West and used socialism as an economic blueprint for India. Of course, it meant India remained stuck in poverty for a long time until the 1991 economic reforms. But considering how the British ruthlessly exploited India through capitalist means, it is important to remember that we were literally conquered and ruled by a company before 1857. And after 1857, the exploitation of India continued, only it became more organized and it was done by an official political government based in London. So, which is why the 1917 revolutions also provided new ideologies, particularly communism and socialism, which would heavily influence the Indian freedom struggle. A lot of our prominent Indian freedom fighters, such as M.N. Roy, they were avowed communists. And after Indian independence, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, himself embraced the USSR stance on economics and turned India into a socialist republic. So moving ahead, one of the most important aspects of our revolutionary freedom struggle, the most important, this one had a direct influence on our Indian independence. It was the threat of the Indian National Iron Army, which was organized by Subhash Chandra Bose. See, the thing is, the British, they had a policy of systematic racism against Indians in India. They primarily believed that Indians could not organize an army by themselves, that they needed British assistance to even to fight militarily anywhere in the world, which is why they so arrogantly and confidently recruited millions of Indians to fight against their enemies in Germany and Japan during World War II. Literally 2.5 million Indians joined voluntarily. So the British in their arrogance believed that Indians could never rebel on their own against their British masters in the military. But the Indian National Army's existence proved that wrong. So the INA was essentially the culmination of decades of revolutionary struggle and networking that was happening throughout the world. Until now, there had been internal plots and conspiracies, usually bomb throwing, gun shooting at prominent British officials. And there had been an attempt at armed mutiny by the Indian soldiers in the form of the Gadar rebellion, but so far all of that had failed. However, in the INA, an official Indian army was constituted as an independent entity operating under an enemy power, that is Japan. So the INA was different, that it provided a means to militarily liberate India by means of an invasion. So the existence of the INA was literally a source of humiliation for the British. Essentially, it shattered the myth that Indians would always be loyal to their British superiors. The INA proved that Indians, if sufficiently inspired and discontented, would rebel against the British masters by creating an army of their own. So the INA proved that Indians, contrary to what the British believed, they could organize a force of their own. They could organize their own army. They could organize their own navy. The INA is said to even had its own air force, which they used to conduct bombings on British targets when they briefly invaded India through the northeastern part of India, especially through Assam in 1944. The INA also had its own artillery, which they used to shell British targets. Then they also had their own medical corps. Every army has a medical corps where medical personnel are sent to assist wounded, to treat wounded soldiers on the battlefield, and the INA had its own medical corps. Essentially, the INA proved the British wrong in their pursued racial supremacy and superiority. It proved that Indians sufficiently motivated could organize and do everything the British did, and probably even better. So, what was the impact of the INA? For this, we need to consider the backdrop of the 1857 mutiny. The 1857 mutiny almost ended British rule in India had it not been for the disorganized nature of the mutiny and the British organizational capacity to muster reinforcements from their outposts throughout the world. But the 1857 mutiny almost came close to ending things for the British, and for the remaining 90 years of the British rule, the British would live in fear of 1857 happening all over again, which is why they sought to manipulate the freedom struggle in such a way to prevent Indians from uniting and organizing armed resistance against them. The existence of the INA reignited those fears of 1857 all over again, which is why after their victory in World War II, the British labeled the INA people as traitors, took them into custody and held them in jails throughout India, and finally held trials for them in Delhi and other places throughout India in order to discredit the INA in the eyes of the Indian public and show them as traitors to the Indian people, hoping to quash the seeds of rebellion, uh, hoping to quash, sorry, I should phrase this properly, hoping to quash the potential for rebellion in the Indian population. As it happened, the impact of the INA trials was literally the opposite. People all over India literally protested against against the trial of people they deemed as their would have been liberators, who were being unjustly tried by an occupying power that was holding India literally by the throat, so to speak. And this the protest by the Indian public throughout India, it also culminated in another important mutiny, which I will talk about later. Yes, as I was saying before, this the mutiny which culminated, which was culminated in by the protests against the Iron Trust was the 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny, which I have talked about earlier in an earlier which I talked about in an earlier video. So what was the trigger for the 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny? So essentially the trigger point for the 1946 mutiny had been the the protest by the Indian soldiers, particularly by the ratings working in the Indian Navy against the racism of their British superiors, in particular the poor quality of food that was provided to them, their discontent simmering at the INA trials and so on, all of which culminated in a vast mutiny that pervaded the Indian armed forces. It started with the Royal Indian Navy, but it also spread to the Indian Army and Air Force as well. This mutiny was what would ultimately cause the British to realize that the loyalty of the Indian soldier was no longer guaranteed, and caused them to pack their bags and leave India on an urgent basis in 1947, not before inflicting one last wound on India, namely the partition of India, which still has drastic consequences on India today. So now that I've talked about all of this, so there is a traditional narrative concerning the Indian freedom struggle, and Sanjeev Sanyal in his book Revolutionaries has put forth a new view on what actually caused India's independence. So the trigger, so traditionally it is believed that the non-violence struggle of Mahatma Gandhi and his associates caused the ethical change of heart among the British, the Satyagraha movements and all, where Indians allowed themselves to be violently beaten by the British. It shamed the British into giving freedom to India. Now nobody knows how effective it really was, but let's say that while the non-violent movements did help to a certain extent, the non-violent movements were not the main reason for India's independence. Sanjeev Sanyal in his book Revolutionaries and other research conducted by historians has proven that what really caused India's independence was the loss of loyalty of the Indian military to the British. The 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny in particular proved to the British that their main pillar of rule over India, the loyalty of the Indian soldier, was no longer trustworthy. They could no longer rely on the Indian soldier to sustain their rule. The fears of 1857 came over the British all over again, causing them to begin preparations to leave India immediately, and they did in 1947. Originally, they had planned to continue to rule India and exploit India, of course, for as long as the Viceroy Lord Linlithgow had estimated that India would need British control of its affairs until 1973. Some wanted India to remain under British rule right until the present day. Now imagine British rule lasting that long. We would still have been an impoverished nation uh, whose affairs are decided by people living in a distant land without any real idea of how things work here. Thankfully, thanks to the loss of the military's loyalty to the British superiors, the British immediately read the writing on the wall and quit India as soon as they could. Then another distinction is the traditional narrative believes that the Quit India movement was what caused the British exit from India. The now proof has been dug up recently that really doubts the fact that whether Quit India movement actually helped to rule India. Several prominent figures have revealed that while the Quit India movement had risen up all over India in order to force the British exit in the light of the Japanese threat, the British had actually managed to successfully quash the Quit India movement within a year or so. By the time World War II ended, there was literally no sign of any mass Indian rebellion, which means the British could comfortably settle back into their usual rule over India. And accordingly, Sanjeev Sanyal in his book, and not only Sanjeev Sanyal, even other prominent figures, even at that very time, namely Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar in an interview to the BBC, and Clement Attlee, the British Prime Minister at the time of India's independence, they all confirmed in separate interviews that what really caused India's independence was the 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny, which I talked about earlier. According to them, the loyalty of the Indian soldier to the British crown had been somewhat affirmed until then, but the activities of Subhash Chandra Bose and his INA caused the Indian soldiers to have a change of heart and caused them to feel guilty about loyalty to their oppressors. So they rose against their British superiors in 1946 en masse, and the British soldiers, reading the writing on the wall, immediately left. And another traditional narrative is it is believed commonly that the British quit India because they were exhausted from the Second World War, that they had fought a war where their country had been bombed to pieces by Nazi Germany, and many people, but British people, they did not really want to take the effort to govern India, and that India was too much of an effort to govern, so they put pressure on their government to quit India. As it happens, proof has emerged over the years, which once again cast doubt on this aspect. As if it were true that World War II was what caused the British to leave India, they should have left India at the end of the First World War itself. After all, the First World War in itself, so many British soldiers had lost their lives in the trenches of Europe, particularly in France. The First World War is said to literally have been consisting of pointless battles where soldiers had been sacrificed in trenches for little to no gain. And yet, despite that, the British continued to sustain their rule over India even after World War One. So why would they quit after World War Two when they could simply continue to milk India like a cow to extract resources from us and to rebuild their country? In fact, had they, it was in their interest to continue to hold on to India, to continue their extortion of resources to rebuild their country from the ravages of World War II as quickly as they could. In fact, Indian independence delayed the rebuilding of the British nation from the damages of World War II for a long time. So it was not in British interest to liberate India by any means. So what really caused the British exit from India? According to Sanjeev Sanyal and other prominent people, what caused the British exit from India was the loss of control over the Indian military in the form of the 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny. So then again, what was the role of the revolutionary movement in Indian independence? According to the narrative that's been propounded so far, the revolutionary movement is believed to have been merely a side factor in Indian independence, essentially consisting of nothing more than unruly armed people who occasionally took pot shots at oppressing British officials, and but whose actions made no impact on the independence of India. Uh, Sanjeev Sanyal's research and other people's research as well has proven the opposite, that the revolutionary movement was not an unruly movement of people, and in fact it was a very systematic, organized, vast network of revolutionaries and other inspired people, not just revolutionaries but their allies and supporters, who apparently were able to even challenge the Indian National Congress itself on several occasions. There was a rivalry between the non-violent aspects of the movement and the violent aspects, and occasionally they would collaborate and work together, This had happened during the non-cooperation movement of 1922, but of 1922. But after the non-cooperation movement was withdrawn, the revolutionaries went back to their armed struggle. So research has proven that the armed struggle was literally the decisive factor for independence. The non-violence movement also helped, but its role is not nearly as decisive as been originally believed. You could say that both the armed struggle and the non-violent movements, they kind of worked, they put collective pressure on the British to withdraw. It was a collaborative effort, not just one movement dominating the other. So moving ahead, now as I said earlier, the after independence, the independent Indian government, they sought to minimize the impact of the revolutionary struggle. Many of the revolutionaries had faced violent and brutal and harsh treatment at the hands of the British authorities. Many of them even ended up being imprisoned in the infamous jail in the Andamans, as Indians commonly call it, Kala Pani. The Andamans was a isolated prison during the British times where revolutionaries and other so-called troublesome and unruly aspects of Indian society were violently imprisoned there, where they would be subjected to extremely harsh and brutal treatment. Prominent people like Vinayak Savarkar were also imprisoned there, and they endured horrible treatment there. The horrors that happened in the Andaman jails in those times, they are there is no speaking, or they are beyond mention. They are beyond speaking. And you could say those atrocities are virtually unspeakable. What happened to the prisoners there under British administration? After independence, the Indian government sidelined the revolutionaries. They were not allowed. They were dismissed from prominent positions. They were not allowed to hold any positions in the independent government and so on. And many of these revolutionaries who had endured imprisonment and harsh treatment, they would suffer from PTSD and other psychological problems from their harsh treatment and so on. So uh, the tragic stories of these revolutionaries were largely forgotten. Then the armed struggle was minimized as simply a movement of thugs and unruly armed people, when in reality it was an organized network, and not just an organized network but literally an intergenerational struggle where senior revolutionaries would pass on their skills and ideals to younger revolutionaries, in a sense passing on the torch. So yes, so this mainstream myths, they have been propagated in school textbooks and so on. We don't really hear much about what happened during the revolutionary struggle. A lot of the incidents, such as the Kakori train conspiracy, Meerut conspiracy, and so on, and other armed struggles that happened, all of which have been minimized, and uh, almost nobody really knows all of this. So the Indian con so moving ahead on this very aspect, as I said earlier, the armed struggle was suppressed by the Indian independent government. So why it was suppressed? It was because the government post 1947, they believed that if the violent struggle was highlighted, it could encourage the wrong sort of thing among the Indian youth. The Indian youth would start believing that violence was the best way to do things. So anytime the Indian government did something disagreeable, people would take up arms and fight violently. So the Indian government sought to minimize the armed struggle. And because many of the founding fathers of independent India were leaders of the non-violent aspect of the freedom struggle, so it was in their nature to highlight their own part in the freedom struggle while suppressing the role of the armed revolutionaries. Then the independent government also wanted to teach a simplified past to the school children. This simplified past means that it essentially they sought to lift Mahatma Gandhi to status of father of the nation. Not saying he doesn't deserve it, he does, but the thing is, the Indian freedom struggle was not really that simple as Mahatma Gandhi inspiring people to non-violently resist the British with the force of the spirit. I mean, that was there and that helped somewhat, but the Indian freedom struggle was a really vast network of complicated, vast global network of revolutionaries as well, where the conspiracies against British rule were hashed, where resources were allocated and used to fight against the British Raj with the help of sympathetic Indian billionaires and so on. All of this the Indian state violently suppressed in order to ensure that no unruliness would occur in the Indian democratic state, to ensure a stable India, so they thought. Then there was a strategic bias. Many of the Indian government, newly independent, was worried that glorifying the revolutionary struggle would in could possibly encourage future militancy against the fragile new state. That people, if discontented against the state, rather than seeking non-violent democratic means, would instead take up arms against the state. Not saying that hasn't happened. I mean, if you take into account the Naxalite and Maoist movements happening in middle India and so on, in the regions of Chhattisgarh and regions of Vidarbha and Maharashtra and so on. So the state didn't quite succeed in suppressing militancy against itself, but because India is a democracy, so people are given a voice where they can be represented. So mostly people don't have need to take up arms against the state like they did under the British Raj. But because the independent government deemed it dangerous to glorify the revolutionary struggle, so revolutionary leaders were considered fringe. They were sidelined and marginalized. Then because of this, what happened is generations of Indians post independence would grow up believing that our freedom was won solely with the spirit of self sacrifice and with the spirit of non violence that Mahatma Gandhi advocated, that armed struggle had nothing to do with it. Now the research by Sanju Sanyal and other prominent people has done a lot to cast serious doubt on this. They have proven that armed struggle also played a very significant role in Indian independence, which I have explained earlier. Then it is now it is the need of the hour that while the non-violent movement continues to be taught in Indian history textbooks, the revolutionary aspect should also be taught. That many of our Indian revolutionary leaders like Raj Behari Bose, who was part of a conspiracy against the British viceroy ruling at the time in say 1922, and who would emigrate to Japan, where he would go on to conduct operations against the British Raj. Then not only Raj Behari Bose, then there were other leaders as well, such as Vinayak Savarkar I talked about. Then obviously there was Subhash Chandra Bose, the leader of the INA, and it is arguable that his legacy is what caused the 1946 Indian naval mutiny and the resulting independence of India. Then there were other leaders as well. Then Sanjeev Sanyal had an ancestor who I don't remember his name, but his very famous ancestor was also a leader of the armed rebellion and who wrote his own book because he wanted to ensure that the revolutionary struggle was not forgotten. post-independence. Then there was Chandrasekhar Azad, one of the important leaders of the Indian freedom struggle, who also fought and gave his life against the British. Essentially, all of these revolutionary leaders, but a lot of them ended up being sidelined and barely spoken of. Even though, if one looks at their deeper history, they waged conspiracies and acts against the British Raj, which were pretty exciting and inspiring in itself. So coming back to this, it is important now to restore the revolutionary aspect of Indian struggle to the core of Indian history, specifically the struggle against the British. It is important to know that first of all, it was an organized resistance which happened for over 50 years, or 90 years if you take 1857 as the first armed rebellion. Then this was not random acts of violence against British officials, but rather a professional network of professionally trained people who knew what they were doing. Then this also had a very then along with organized resistance, it also had a global reach. That it essentially reached out all over the world. There were vast networks set up all around the world uh, where revolutionaries would receive aid from their supporters and allies in their fight against the oppressive British Raj. Essentially, the British Raj was opposed not just on the Indian front but also on the front in Britain, in Germany, in Japan, and several other places. In Ireland as well. In fact, the Irish were such strong supporters of our Indian independence struggle, such that during World War II, when Subhash Chandra Bose declared his India. Essentially, what had happened is during the World War II, Subhash Chandra Bose had successfully managed to conquer some areas of British controlled India, namely the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and portions of Northeast India as well. So over there he established an independent Indian Republic as declared by him, and he started issuing his own currency. For obvious reasons, neither Britain nor its allies recognized Subhash Chandra Bose's state, with one exception. That exception being Ireland. Ireland was as a state allied to Britain, and yet it recognized Subhash Chandra Bose's independent Indian state. So that's how the Irish were closely tied to the Indian struggle. Then the revolutionary struggle had a decisive impact on Indian independence. The British were forced to leave India because of military force and because of armed rebellions, particularly the mutiny that happened in 46 in the Indian Navy and elsewhere. And not to mention the threat of armed rebellion, a repeat of 1857, a potential repeat of 1857 caused the British to finally quit India. After independence, however, the Indian government chose to sideline the revolutionary struggle. So it is important to remember this revolutionary struggle. It's important to remember the serious effort the revolutionaries put in to liberate India. Let us all remember the sacrifices they put in to ensure our freedom, especially considering how these revolutionaries were literally brutally jailed and violently treated by the British, and the British even arranged for their deaths in jails on several occasions, not just by official execution but also by unethical illegal means as well. So essentially, uh, so essentially it is important for all of us to remember the revolutionary struggle. So essentially, it is important to honor the architects of the independence of India, not just the non-violent revolutionaries like Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and their associates, but also the violent revolutionaries as well. Those who died, those who ended up perishing during the British Raj so that India may live. That's what they said. That's the important thing to remember. By the time India became independent, a lot of the revolutionaries and their leaders had been brutally treated, and many of them even ended up dying at the hands of the Britishers. Meaning, when India became independent, not a lot of them remained in powerful positions to push their narrative. So their struggle was forgotten. But we must not forget the armed aspect of our Indian freedom struggle, the brutal treatment and sacrifices they underwent for our freedom. So let us all remember all of this, and let us all remember the sacrifice of our brave freedom fighters, in particular the legends like Chandrasekhar Azad, Subhash Chandra Bose, the INA veterans, and the Royal Indian Navy mutiny people. In particular, let us that said, there have been efforts made to honor the revolutionaries in recent years. After independence, when it comes to the INA, a lot of them were not recruited by the Indian army. The Indian government prohibited their recruitment. However, under the Narendra Modi government in 2018, I think it was before, the last remaining veterans of the INA were invited to the Republic Day parade. Then the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were also renamed as Swarajya and Shaheed by the Modi government, again as a tribute to the freedom fighters who endured brutal imprisonment at the hands of the British during the Raj. Then the Indian Navy celebrated the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny of 1946 at a function in 2022. Essentially efforts have been made to honor the revolutionaries now. It's a bit too late, but still it's a progress towards recognizing the revolutionary aspect. So let us all continue to remember all of this. Sadly though, one aspect of the Indian revolutionaries has not been honored. I mean, it was not honored. The 1946 Royal Indian Navy mutiny people, they were also not recruited by the Indian Army as well. But thankfully, the Indian Navy has recognized their contribution as well now. So let us all remember the revolutionary aspect of the Indian freedom struggle, the courage our freedom fighters, particularly the revolutionaries, faced in the struggle for independence, how they were brutally treated, how they were imprisoned, they were even killed by the British horribly. So let us all remember our brave freedom fighters and their leaders, our leaders. So thank you all for watching this video. I hope this video has proven enlightening to you all when it comes to the revolutionary aspect of India's freedom struggle. I would, if any of you want to read more about this, please read Sanjeev Sanyal's book Revolutionaries, How the Other Side of How India Won Its Freedom. It's a very good book, easy to read and very entertaining, very enlightening. It's very readable, written in simple language. You can get it online, purchase it from Amazon or other websites, available at very low cost. So thank you again all for watching this video. I hope this video has enlightened you all about the topic that I spoke about. Please subscribe to my channel at Siddharth History Z8H and recommend my channel for more of my videos, and recommend my channel to anyone else you know. Please also watch, like, and recommend this video to anyone else you know, and also comment on this video should you have the desire to do so. Once again, thank you all for watching this video. Thank you all for your time. Thank you. Thank you.